Welcome everyone to the Global Education Colloquium at Drexel University. My name is Christy Kelly and I'm a faculty member here in the School of Education, and very excited to welcome all of you zooming in from all over the world today. We have a very special welcome to Dr. Morgan Ames, who will be presenting on her research and the book that she's produced, which is fabulous. For those of you who've had a chance to read it, I know you'll agree with me. We're very excited to hear about the Charisma Machine, the life, death, and legacy of one laptop per child. If this is your first time attending a colloquium, welcome. We'll have a few words of introduction. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're zooming in from so we can get to know each other a little bit better. After I introduce Dr. Ames, she'll have lots of time to be able to introduce her research, and we'll have time for a question and answer at the end. We will close the recording at 1 p.m. Eastern on the hour. For those of you who need to leave and go to other events, you'll be able to watch the recording later. And if you're able to stay on for more informal conversation, please do after we stop the recording. So let me introduce you to Dr. Ames. She is a faculty member in the School of Informatics at the University of California, Berkeley, and also is teaching in the data science program and administers the designated emphasis in science and technology studies. She is associate director of the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Dr. Ames researches the ideological origins of inequality in the technology world with a focus on utopianism, childhood, and learning. The questions that drive her current projects concern the ways in which young people construct their identities with computers and how computers and the technology design practices that produce them shape the identities they construct. Her book, The Charisma Machine, is grounded in sociology of development, sociology of technology, and utopianism. She follows her book actually is about the One Laptop Per Child project, which captivated the technology world and beyond in the years following its 2005 announcement. It serves as a case study in the complicated consequences of technological utopianism in development projects. This book examines what made the One Laptop Per Child and its laptops so captivating, and even the most outrageous claims about it so compelling. Despite the project's high profile, hailing from the MIT Media Lab and becoming known around the world, very little is actually known about how the project's laptops have been used day to day and what impact they've had. And this is the important gap that her book fills. We're very excited to hear about your research today, Dr. Ames. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking today about what is in some ways a very historical project at this point, right? This is a project announced 15 years ago. But I'm going to be trying to emphasize some of the ongoing implications within the EdTech space and across the technology world more broadly. To start though, what I'm going to do is let OLPC kind of speak for themselves. So this is a commercial that One Laptop Per Child produced in 2007, and I'll talk a little bit about the context of its production afterwards, but it introduces a lot of the kind of main philosophical tenets of the project. So we're going to start with this.
One laptop per child. That's our name and our vision. We want to create educational opportunities for the world's poorest children by providing each and every one with a rugged, low-cost, low-power, connected laptop. This is that laptop. Say hello to the XO. A computer unlike any other, designed specifically to work in tough conditions and remote areas. It comes packed with software and activities to help kids learn, explore, create, and share. No matter what language they speak or where they live, the XO connects them to each other, to the world, and to a brighter future. We're a nonprofit organization, which makes these kids our mission, not our market. That's why wherever the XO goes, there are 5 core principles everyone agrees to. First, kids get to keep the laptops. They have to be free to take them home and use them whenever they want. That's kind of the point. Second, we're focused on early education, which means kids about 6 to 12 years old. Third, we have to deal in large numbers of laptops, so whole classrooms and schools get them at the same time, so no one gets left out. Fourth, kids should have a connection to the internet, because there's neat stuff to learn on the internet. Fifth and finally, the XO must include free and open source software, then the laptop itself can easily grow and adapt with the needs of the child. So, in a nutshell, that's us, an organization that makes a small computer to serve a big cause, bringing education to children all over the world, with one laptop per child.
All right, this Amazon link is because this was produced for a program in 2007 and 8 called Give One, Get One. You might recall it if you were following this project back then. You could buy one of these OLPC laptops at twice the price, and one of them would come to you. A second one would go somewhere to some child somewhere in the world. They never really told people where they were going, but from following this project, I found out that most of them ended up in Haiti. So if you purchased one through this, a child in Haiti ended up with one of these machines. And I have a couple from that Give One, Get One program, one here. So there's a lot going on in this commercial. If this were a media studies class, for example, we could easily spend maybe the whole class kind of going into it, right? Analyzing all of the implications it brings up. I'm going to highlight just a few things right now. So first, we heard a lot of giggling throughout, right? Giggling children. This was kind of equating having this laptop with play. We heard the narrator equate the possession of this laptop with, quote, educational opportunities, and then later with, quote, connecting to the world and to a brighter future. When we were first introduced to the EXO, it kind of crashed in as if it were tossed or jumped, and then it moved its ears, nodded its head and said hello. So we get this anthropomorphization of this machine. It then showed a cartoon laptop on the very tip top of a mountain, literally getting rained on while the narrator talked about ruggedness. There isn't a lot of electronics that would be okay with these kinds of conditions, and it turns out the EXO wasn't that different. It then showed Wikipedia in English and then a BBC screen, Learn English, even as the narrator said it would connect children no matter what language they speak. I thought that was a very interesting choice they made there. It then talked about kids owning their laptops as if this was a good thing, never mind the kinds of implications of who'd be responsible for repairs, right? It also showed laptops literally growing on trees. So there's this kind of naturalistic metaphor, right? That kind of erases those networks of manufacture, supply, and maintenance that are anything but naturally occurring. The statement, there's neat stuff to learn on the internet, has a lot packed into it that I won't have a lot of time to unpack, but I did just want to say that's quite a statement. And finally, it talked about free and open source software and how with it, the laptop itself can easily grow and adapt with the needs of the child. So again, we get these kind of natural, almost inevitable, organic metaphors creeping in. Free and open source software was in fact really important to the popularity of the project, which is something I'll talk a little bit more in a moment, and I go into a lot more detail in the book. So there's a lot to unpack even in just this one commercial, right? This is a kind of perfect microcosm of the project more broadly, as is, there it is, this quote from Nicholas Negroponte. Now, I tend not to want to lean too much on Nicholas Negroponte as kind of an emissary for the project. He was the project spokesperson. He was one of the co-founders of the project. And for many, he's the public face of it, but he sometimes said things that were a lot more extreme than other people on the project actually believed. In this case, though, he said, I don't want to place too much on OLPC, but if I really had to look at how to eliminate poverty, create peace, and work on the environment, I can't think of a better way to do it. There were a lot of people who believed some or a lot of this, right? Those who joined One Laptop Per Child clearly felt very strongly about it, but a lot of people around the tech world resonated with these kinds of statements. I want you to, as best you can, imagine the tech world of 2005. So it's easy to look at this with our 2021 eyes and be like, what could he be thinking, right? But in 2005, so this was before iPhones, so before smartphones as we know them today, before netbooks were a widespread thing, so before Chromebooks, before some of these other things. There were some early ones, but they were really niche items. This is before maker spaces, before MOOCs. There had been some earlier waves of video-assisted mass education movements, but not the current instantiation. And this is before tech-heavy charter schools really took off in the way they did today. This is before Facebook was a big thing, right? It existed, but it was not nearly the juggernaut it was today. So it was a really different kind of tech space. So in order to start, I want to just talk briefly about what it means to me to study what I call a charismatic technology. So part of it is this history, right? Thinking about what it's like to be in the context of when this project rolled out. Also looking at the antecedents of the project, because it turns out this was not the first ed tech project that the people who were involved in One Laptop Per Child had been involved in. They had been involved in many waves of ed tech projects before this. And one big question I had, why did OLPC inspire such utopianism in so many people? And where have similar promises been made, both about the projects those same people developed as well as other ones, right? This, I feel like, is only half the story, though. So the other half of the story that I try to tell with this project, and I pursue more generally, is ethnographic. I want to know what happens when these are actually, you know, come up against the mundanities and the messiness of our everyday lives. How do these charismatic visions translate? And then, of course, what can we learn from this project that might apply to other projects, other ideas in the tech world that circulate, other ideas in ed tech? So when I say charismatic technology, there are a few elements here I want to distinguish. So if we might think about our you know, maybe our smartphones as almost as fetish objects. And I think this was especially true of early iPhones. People were really fixated on the material object, right? There was something about having that thing. And at the time, there wasn't an app store. There wasn't a lot that these could do that normal phones couldn't, but there was something special about that object. I would say this project's a little bit different. The object itself, the laptop, is a frustrating machine to use. It's slow. It is, it's pretty clunky. It doesn't have a lot of ports on it. What was so captivating about it is what it promised to do in the world. So charisma is much more about this possibility or promise of action, not about the material thing itself. These promises gave the people on OLPC, as well as those following the project, contributing to it in various ways, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, and conviction about the project doing the right thing in the world, right? It also made their progress seem inevitable. It made them feel like once they got these out there, success would follow, right? This also tends to foreclose alternatives. So if people are really invested in this vision, they say, well, yes, we could pay teachers more. Yes, we could build out school infrastructure. Yes, we could do these other things, but that's really treading water. And there were some OLPC leaders who literally said, those kinds of reforms are like treading water. This is going to really revolutionize things. I'm going to argue next that this charisma is also somewhat ideologically conservative, and I'll get into exactly what I mean by that coming up. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what inspired One Laptop Per Child. So Negroponte himself, who was definitely the most recognizable public spokesperson for the project, often said it was not his idea. He credited in almost every talk he gave, at least the ones that were recorded and I could watch, he credited Seymour Papert, a fellow professor at the MIT Media Lab, with the first inspiration of it. He would say something along the lines of this quote: the initial ideas for One Laptop Per Child came in the late 1960s and early 1970s when a man named Seymour Papert made a very simple observation, and that was that children learn different. I feel like this is a channeling of that Think Different Apple campaign, when they write computer programs, because the act of writing a computer program is the closest you can come to thinking about thinking. So there's a lot packed into this statement, right? There's this equating of computers and minds that is still very popular in discourses about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and really has its roots in many ways at MIT prior to Media Lab, but in the lab that Seymour Papert joined and Nicholas Negroponte was also kind of peripherally part of, run by Marvin Minsky in the 1960s. All right, so this is a picture of Seymour Papert. This was taken a little bit later, probably in the 80s. And the legacy that this project has, of course, is very strong at the place where Negroponte and Papert were professors, the MIT Media Lab. So Papert in particular pioneered a new idea around learning called constructionism. Now, this is a very overloaded term. There's social constructivism. There are a lot of different ideas. But when Papert talks about it, constructionism borrows fairly heavily from Piaget's constructivism, but builds a few things on top of it. In particular, he says that laptops are especially good tools to learn with. And they, in fact, transcend this kind of boundary between the kind of material, concrete learning and the more abstract learning. There's also a very strong child-driven aspect to this. So there's almost a kind of oppositional attitude that comes out in constructionism as Seymour Papert describes it. It's almost anti-school. The way he talks about school is very, very negative. So there's this kind of anti-school, I taught myself sensibility, which is also very kind of permeating the MIT Media Lab ethos more generally. Constructionism came to the mainstream through Seymour Papert's book Mindstorms. This was published in 1980 and went on to become a bestseller, still in print, still taught in many classrooms at the MIT Media Lab and beyond. And among other things, it described what Seymour Papert's branch of the logo programming language, and in particular, turtle graphics. So in this picture, you see Papert has a little dome computer. This is called a turtle. Later, it became a little virtual triangle that you moved around. In fact, at my own elementary school in the 80s, I learned some turtle graphics. Sorry about that. And I imagine a number of you have also encountered turtles in various cases. So where do these ideas come from? So when Papert he finished his PhD, he studied with Piaget himself in Geneva for a few years, and then he was looking for faculty jobs. And he said MIT was especially attractive because of a group of not employees of Marvin Minsky, but kind of hobbyists who use Marvin Minsky's lab with Minsky's permission to do very playful things with computers. This was incredibly interesting to Papert. He talked about a lot in his writing about this group's wonderful sense of playfulness, quote, that I had experienced there on brief visits. This came together, Papert says in Mindstorms, in all-night sessions around a PDP-1 computer that had been given to Minsky. It was pure play. In a later book, Papert says, at MIT, I had my first experience of the excitement and the holding power that keeps people working all night on their computers. I realized that children might be able to enjoy the same advantages, a thought that changed my life. So this is the addition to Piaget's constructivism that Papert adds, right? This is what makes constructionism unique, this attachment to computers in particular. There is also in Papert's writing and within the One Laptop Per Child project more broadly, a really strong sense of nostalgia. One thing that I found among OLPC contributors, not just employees, but the kind of broader open source community that wrote software and contributed in other ways to the project, there were very often discussions about what was your first computer? What were your first experiences with computers? And people were very open about drawing on those experiences in their design choices for One Laptop Per Child. Papert himself in Mindstorm says, I shall in fact concentrate on those ways of thinking that I know best. I begin by looking at what I know about my own development. Now, this is something I think we all do somewhat naturally. We, of course, draw on our own experiences. But one thing that I critique here is that Papert and others didn't contextualize those experiences. They didn't understand, the privilege that went into them, the kind of environmental factors, the social factors that shaped their interests. It was a very kind of hero narrative that came out. Papert, I did just want to say Papert did contribute to other commercial products. Lego Mindstorms is named after that 1980 book. So there are a number of kind of other spin-offs from this project. I want to, though, dwell a little bit more on this idea that I call in the book a technically precocious boy and this role of nostalgia, because it's something that resonates more broadly in our culture. And there have been other authors that do a wonderful job unpacking just what we mean by this. So one thing that One Laptop Per Child leaned on quite heavily was this idea that children are not encumbered by the same kinds of societal concerns and social conventions that adults are, right? And this, of course, is true in many ways. But the kind of trope they leaned on was that children are closer to nature. They're not enculturated, and so they can be the agents of change within a culture. And this puts a lot on children, although it probably sounds fairly common, right? We hear those kinds of narratives all the time within our culture more broadly. So this is an 1898 painting that kind of shows, children closer to nature. There is something interesting in this painting, though. You might notice that it's the boys who are being rambunctious. There is one girl in the painting. She's sitting over to the side. She has a very nice, clean white pinafore, and she's, I think, maybe writing or drawing. She's being very calm. So within this idea that children are a little bit more wild, a little bit more closer to nature, there is a gendered angle that does not often get kind of carefully examined, right? We also see the same kinds of narratives in Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn by Mark Twain, Peter Pan, right? There's all kinds of archetypes within boyhood specifically for this kind of wild, closer to nature sort of child. This gets tied to technical concerns post-World War II. And Amy Ogata has a wonderful book called Designing the Creative Child that talks about some of these processes. There are also, of course, a long history of toys that are specifically aimed at boys and channeling. Somehow I got muted, sorry. Sorry about that. Should I go back a little bit? I'm not sure how long that's been.
I guess you were talking about channeling and then it muted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm an errant click or something. So yeah, there are, of course, a number of toys that channel these kind of wild ideas into what adults see as productive ends, right? So these are some examples of toys through history. A number of toy makers have become a little bit more sensitive about the gendered messages, but they still lean on the fact that people recognize these tropes, right? And One Laptop Per Child didn't do a lot to counter it. Of course, their rhetoric was all children are included. This is not just for boys. This is for both boys and girls. But the kinds of things they included on the laptop really evoked these kinds of boy cultures that have been built up within the media for many decades. So what did this laptop look like? So the early prototypes, non-working prototypes, I must add, had a hand crank for charging. This never existed on an actual computer. You can kind of see here, no hand crank here. But they did replace that hand crank with kind of those anthropomorphic ears. You saw them move in the commercial. You saw the screen swivel, kind of like a head turning. They really wanted this to be a playful machine. They had a playful appearance. Even the logo looks like a child with its arms flung wide. They also did design this to be rugged. So it's not, a really fragile machine. They did try to make it rugged. Nicholas Negroponte loved to fling a laptop across, a closed laptop, I must say, across the stage to demonstrate this ruggedness. And they also promised that it would be so easy to repair that a child could do it and moreover would want to. This would be a really interesting way for them to learn about the machine. There were lots of games and game engines that shipped with this machine. This again centers this kind of technical play that has been tied to boy culture for many decades before this. The software was all open source, and a number of things had been previously developed at MIT around constructionist ideas. So Scratch, which was still kind of in early stages at the time, shipped on this machine. The Tam Tam Music suite shipped on it. eToys, which is not a Papert project per se, it was more of an Alan Kay project, but had very similar ideas in it, also went shipped on this machine. Notably, there was no teacher interface. There was nothing for teachers to, for example, push ideas, push assignments or anything to all the students, or for them to collect assignments from students. There was no way for them to, monitor what students were doing on the machine other than walk around and look or ask students to share. The machine was very much egalitarian. It did not raise anybody up above others. And this again reflects that ethos of, you teach yourself, you build your own, you construct your own knowledge, and that kind of anti-authority angle that we talked just a little bit about, and I talk more about in the book. In the initial project, there was also mesh networking to allow these computers to connect with one another without having to go through a central access point, so it could be blocked. This would also allow them to share internet connections. It turns out, though, that these machines were so slow. They had a very slow processor, about equivalent to a 486, which was kind of mid-90s tech, that they had to take mesh networking out of later iterations of the software because it just didn't work. But all in all, these features embodied a lot of the values and social imaginaries of Constructionism, as well as that MIT hacker culture that Papert was a part of, and this equivalence between AI systems and the mind that Marvin Minsky's lab in particular was known for. So there's a lot of things that get packed into this machine, as well as this idea that computers would be naturally alluring, that children would want to use them. So just to cap up, we have a few different elements here. We have a charisma of computers, right? This hope that this expectation that computers would be captivating to all children. We had a charisma of childhood, and especially boyhood, as that kind of wilder, closer to nature kind of state that's very much anchored in a particular time and place, has not always been understood that way. And we have a charisma for a kind of rebellious nature, right? Rebellion against school, rebellion against authority figures. And in fact, Seymour Papert, Nicholas Negroponte, Walter Bender, other leaders for One Laptop Per Child would often say that children would quickly leapfrog past the adults in their lives. They would become adept with these machines, and they would learn much more about them than the adults in their lives understood. All right. So just to sum up, we talked about a lot of aspects of this, and I want to dwell in particular on the fact that these ideas about childhood, these ideas about technology, this idea of nostalgic design, in some ways is ideologically conservative. And I don't, of course, mean politically conservative. I mean conservative as a small c, but it's not, these aren't new ideas, right? These are ideas that have appeared in other technologies. And this was, I argue, the reason that the project resonated, because people saw themselves and their own childhood experiences, their own hero narratives reflected in the narratives of this project. All right, so what happened in the world when these things were put out into use? I want to fairly briefly touch on what the bulk of my book focuses on, and that's what happened to these laptops when they were put to use. So if we think about documentaries like The Social Dilemma, which came out in this last year, they portray the tech world as puppet masters, right? They're able to force people to follow their will. And even though that was a very negative framing, OLPC very much framed the project along these tech deterministic lines, but in a more positive way, right? We saw that a little bit in that opening commercial, and project leaders often reinforced that in public and mailing lists, that once they got these laptops out there, the ideas that were behind these laptops would naturally kind of steer children towards the kinds of uses that they imagined. So a few of the quotes that exemplify this, I think. Nicholas Negroponte once said, this was about a later iteration of the project, but we'll take tablets and drop them out of helicopters, literally, into villages that have no electricity in school, then go back a year later and see if the kids can read. And the way he framed this more generally in this talk was, of course they will. Of course they'll be able to hack these things. Never mind how to charge them and how to, recognize the letters, all sorts of questions, right? There was such a faith that this would work. Walter Bender also said in a talk, this is in some ways a Trojan horse, a backdoor into overhauling the entire education system of a lot of the countries we are talking about. And this is the Trojan horse motif is something that appeared in a few other talks by OLPC leaders, including Nicholas Negroponte, which is a kind of funny metaphor to use because, of course, the Trojan horse is not a positive story per se, but again, it gets at this, we're going to capture the imaginations of children, and they're going to leapfrog past everybody else, right? So one big question I had, of course, is what happens when this translation process takes place? I went into the field asking three big questions. One, of course, was how are these machines used in classrooms, because they actually were being used in classrooms, and people were wrestling with them. There was infrastructures and institutions that they came up in contact with. But OLPC's narrative was that it wasn't the classroom that would be most interesting. So of course, I also asked, what are children doing with them in their free time when they're not bound by school assignments, et cetera. And of course, what does this mean more broadly for similar sorts of projects that make similar sorts of promises? So for this project, I went to Paraguay. There were about just over 2.5 million of these laptops sold around the world. This isn't the millions, hundreds of millions that they had wanted to sell, but it's still a significant number. And about 85% of them went to Latin America. These projects ranged from a few thousand to 1 million in both Peru and Uruguay. And I visited both Peru and Uruguay. Both are government-run projects. Both are fairly wary of outsiders, so I didn't get a lot of access, right? Peru has gotten a lot of bad press over the years for pretty lackluster results. And in fact, what I found in my visit is that they really put very few resources into this project, right? It was a publicity stunt. They handed out laptops, they got reelected, and then promises of solar panels and teacher training and various things never materialized. Anita Se-Chan has done some really wonderful work in Peru on the One Laptop Per Child project, as well as other kinds of socio-technical imaginaries in that space. I encourage you to look at her work for Peru. Paraguay, though, in contrast, it was run by an NGO, and they put a lot of resources into their program. So it isn't the largest, but many in OLPC said it was the best run. So I was really interested in, okay, well, Peru tells us what happens when these projects are not well supported. What happens when a project is well supported? All right, so this is the NGO. This is the staff of the NGO, more or less, when I was there doing field work with them. Raul, who's in the front here with the brown shirt, was the main founder of the project and is, in fact, a fairly talented programmer. And a lot of these people had been educated. They're from the Paraguayan elite. They've been educated in the States or Europe. They're definitely Paraguayan. I don't want to make any claims of that, but the kinds of lives that they had within Paraguay were pretty different from the kinds of lives that the children they wanted to reach were. So Paraguay Educa, first and foremost, did not just give out laptops and walk away. They put a lot of work into building out the infrastructure so that these would work. In the picture on the left, for example, you'll see, for one thing, you'll see little XOs painted on the school, which they put in when they did some other infrastructural upgrades. They had to put plugs in all the classrooms. The classrooms didn't have plugs. You can see kind of behind this girl in the pink, a tower that's red and then white and then a little bit of red. It goes up fairly high. It's a WiMAX tower that they installed so that these schools could share an internet connection that was donated by a local telecom. They put in these wireless access points. You see in the middle picture a technician installing one of them all over these schools. And they also put in school servers, which you see on the right here. These school servers, they put them in cages to prevent theft, even though the access points didn't work nearly as well in a cage, much to the technicians grumbled constantly about it. But this, one thing I want to emphasize here is that these schools were incredibly under-resourced, right? This was a lot of infrastructural upgrades that they had to do in these schools. The role of teachers was also really central to Paraguay Educa's mission. And this was in part because they had promised the government, in exchange for access to give these kids laptops through the schools, that they would do a lot of teacher training. And so this was before a training session was started. This is a number of teachers. And a lot of these teachers hadn't owned a computer before. This was 2009, 2010. Penetration of computers in Paraguay was about 10% or a little less than 10%. So a lot of what this training session covered was Here's how you get on the web. Here's how you use email, right? Let's get you all email addresses. Here's kind of the basic functionality of all of the programs. Paraguay Educa, though, had hoped that the overall vision of the project would, once the teachers knew this basic functionality, would translate pretty naturally. And this was in part because of those naturalistic metaphors that OLPC used all the time, right? That teachers would really be captivated to kind of reform their curricula around this laptop and to really capture the, oh goodness, sorry, the passion that people felt, oh gosh, sorry, there we go, that they felt for this project. There were, however, a lot of challenges to classroom use that teachers ran into. These teachers, frankly, in interview after interview, said they had much bigger concerns than this laptop project. They had to teach 4 subjects a day in only 3.5 hours of school. They did it again with a different student body in the afternoon. They taught two student bodies throughout the day. They had no textbooks. They had no photocopiers, paper supplies, pencils, other things. If they gave pencils out to students, it was their own personal pencils. They had to bring their own chalk. The kids brought their own notebooks and pencils. And these were the main tools of Paraguayan classrooms. On top of all of this, they have very low pay and no benefits. And of course, this is unfortunately a narrative that we hear all too often across a lot of places around the world where the work that teachers do is undervalued, right? But within the context of this, teachers did not have time to reform curriculum. And honestly, they saw this laptop as a little toy. They did not see it as something that was educational. So there was very little use in the first year. Paraguay Educa, to their credit, saw this and said, what these teachers need is more resources. They hired full-time teacher trainers for every school. And these trainers provided ongoing social support for teacher use. This was, of course, expensive. It's hard to scale, right? So you need more staff to scale it. And so for a little NGO, it's very hard to raise money for these ongoing maintenance kinds of costs, right? And so eventually they had to discontinue the teacher trainer program and more or less the whole program entirely. So even with this, though, there were failures of translation, and a lot of it was based around some of those promises that OLPC made early. One big one was that these laptops did break and they could not be repaired by children. Screens especially broke and were about $65 to replace. The chargers would also break and were cheaper, but and people could share them, of course. But once the screen broke, you couldn't really use the laptop anymore. There was no port to plug in an external screen. Not many people had external screens that they could plug in. And here you even see in the laptop on the right, or maybe it's the left, sorry, it might be mirror image. Oh, it's probably the right, that's right. You'll see some broken pixels, right? So these kinds of problems made these really frustrating to use. When I was there doing my field work, a little over a year into the project, I found that 15% of laptops were unusably broken. And these weren't software issues, which the tech support team could repair. These were hardware issues. OLPC hadn't provisioned for any repair parts, or basically no repair parts. And so Paraguay had to go to the much bigger project in Uruguay and make a deal with them to buy lots of these repair parts, because Uruguay was big enough to go straight to the manufacturers for it. So that's 15% of the laptops. Another 50% were just not interesting to the kids. They didn't want to use them. They'd rather go play soccer. They were helping babysit younger siblings in some cases. They were helping with family businesses, and they did not find this machine interesting. So this really pushes back against this assumption that once this gets out there, it would be naturally captivating to all these kids, right? So what about, I've talked about 50% plus 15, what about that other 35%, right? There were about a third of the kids who were using these machines more often, but they brought their own meanings to them. They were very interested in juegitos, the little games, and they wanted to use these as media machines. And anyone who's worked with kids, of course, says, of course they did, right? Even within this landscape of the internet, a decade ago, 2010, 2011, that the internet was a media rich place. Kids wanted to watch music videos. They wanted to listen to music. They wanted to play, little side scroll. At the time, Flash was still a big thing, Flash games. And interestingly enough, this laptop, even though it shipped with some basic games, was really not built for the media-rich environment of 2010 internet. It came with a 1 gigabyte hard drive. That's not working memory, that's hard drive, which quickly filled up. So kids would uninstall software that their teachers might want to use in the classroom. They had full control of the machine, so they could do whatever they wanted. They uninstalled everything they could so they could download, anime episodes. There were also a couple companies that developed games specifically for the XO to market to these kids. So in some ways, I celebrate the kids, their own agency in this project, right? I am, though, the critical media scholar in me is critical of the fact that corporations like Nestle, like Nickelodeon, capitalized on this, right? There is something that is I find very pernicious about the creep of advertising into school environments, and this is no different. So one thing that pretty much everyone in the project felt at least some charisma towards, even if they didn't use their machine very much, was the internet. And this wasn't only the children, this was also the teachers. So one teacher said, we had a meeting with phase 1 teachers. This was kind of the first rollout of the project in Paraguay. And everyone had their XOs and were checking their email, everyone looking at their screen and not paying attention. Then we turned off the internet and the whole room closed their XOs and began to pay attention. So I'm sure we've all seen this, right? And of course, right now, we all have to be on our computers all of the time. This is the only way we're able to talk and connect. But the internet for this group was also very charismatic and not something, at least in 2010, they had much access to. This had changed when I did some follow-up fieldwork in 2013. But yeah, that was one aspect of the project that was very captivating for a lot of people. Whoop. So I want to talk about something I hinted at earlier when I talked about that teacher training program, right? The teacher trainer program was important for getting any use in classrooms, any laptop use in classrooms. There were other things about this machine, of course, that made it really frustrating to use in classrooms. Children would show up without them charged. There wasn't a lot of charging capacity. They don't install programs. A lot of what teachers did with these machines was fairly basic if they used them at all in the classroom. But those teacher trainers in particular were an ongoing, pretty substantial expense for the NGO. And it went against this promise that they had to make early on to the government and to others of easy change. Once they bought these laptops, change would follow, right? And this was a promise that we saw one laptop per child making as well. These charismatic projects almost always have to make these kinds of promises of easy change. Once we get the technology out there, cultural change will follow. And this points to a catch-22 and a kind of dark side I see in these projects. One is that we expect quick fixes from ed tech more broadly, from development projects, and then I talk more in the book about the fact that sometimes people then only see what they want to see. So while I was there was a person from One Laptop Per Child who visited the project, and the whole project kind of mobilized to perform success to him, because if they didn't, that would be compromising this charismatic vision, right? And he had no interest in scratching the veneer of that performance, which was in many cases very fragile, right? There was a lot of things about the project that were not successful. And this is something I'm exploring a little bit more in follow-up projects. This points to a catch-22 of project funding, though, because these projects have to make these promises to get funding generally. And then they either have to show the small but still present steps that they've made towards that promise, which don't live up to the promises they made, or they have to perform success. And in either way, they often don't get follow-up rounds of funding for maintenance, for support, for all of these things. These projects are not set up for the kinds of long-term support that they would need to have any kind of success. All right, so I want to just sum up some of the messages that we've learned, some of the lessons that we've maybe learned from this project. One is that charisma has value. Right? It's easy to kind of dunk on charisma after hearing a story like this, but this provided conviction and purpose to the people on the project. It smoothed away uncertainty. It made progress seem inevitable. It rallied resources. This is how these projects get money. They make these kinds of promises, but there are consequences to it. There's this catch-22 I just referred to, right? You have to promise big, and it favors short-term projects. There's also a tendency towards, in this project especially, and I would say in ed tech possibly more broadly, a tendency towards nostalgic design. And this is designing for not even one's real past, right? It was really drawing on those hero narratives when it's all just about the person and the child and the machine, and not about the whole constellation of resources that supported them, that gave them access, that answers their questions, et cetera, right? So it's designed for a mythologized past, not an actual past, and not the actual present, not children today. So those are some of the consequences I certainly saw in this project. And we, of course, see the same kinds of stories get echoed in other projects that have come out in the last decade or so, right? When I was doing fieldwork, MOOCs were the very big, hot new thing. Everyone was talking about how MOOCs are going to displace, university systems, primary education, everything all around the world. And study after study has found that those who benefit most from MOOC classes are those who are already highly educated, very well resourced, often men, because online spaces are often more welcoming for men generally. And so the promise to democratize education through MOOCs has fallen flat in many of the same ways one laptop per child does. We might also think about, tech-heavy charter schools, about the maker movement. I do want to say, of course, that maker spaces are very diverse. There's some wonderful feminist maker spaces that I love, and a lot of really equity-oriented, inclusion-oriented movements within this, but a lot of the narrative around maker spaces coming out of the maker movement and through fab labs and such was still tied to a lot of these same kinds of utopian tropes. I encourage you, and I'd love to hear maybe in questions if you have any other thoughts for other projects that echo these same kinds of tropes. With that, though, I want to thank you so much for listening. I know I've talked for a long time. I'd love to hear some of your questions now. Thank you for your time. And I'll stop my share so I can see all of your faces.
Thank you so much. I mean, I've read the book. It's amazing. I know a lot of you here showing up today have also read the book for classes or on your own. So thank you again for sharing your time and expertise. We have time for questions. If you'd like to either maybe raise your hand or put your name in the chat, we'll call on you. Or Morgan, you can certainly invite people to open their mics and ask questions, comments, reflections.
Yeah, so I see Moe has a hand up. Go ahead if you want to start.
Yeah, hey, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, if that's okay. One is just to clarify, were the laptops used basically just as a digital textbook, like they weren't really, were they just using it to use technology?
That's a great question. So I would say One Laptop Per Child and Paraguay Educa really hoped that kids would basically teach themselves to program with this, that it would be very different from a digital textbook. They wanted them to, learn logo, use Scratch, kind of learn the basics of programming. And that's something I go into in a lot more detail in the book. And sorry, it's so hard to cover everything in just one talk, but yeah, they really wanted kids to use these in a very different way. The way they actually were used was often a little bit more like a digital textbook, just because that was what kind of translated into the classroom when maybe only a third of your kids had a working machine, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the use I often saw was much more like any other computer, but yeah, the idea was something very different.
Okay, that makes sense then, because my next question was going to be if they learn to program then. So it sounds like that was the goal, but it just did not translate that well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And of course, this is something that I think a lot of kind of programming, learn to code kinds of initiatives run into, right? There are a lot of kids who aren't really captured by that idea, that don't really care to learn to code. And while I think, you know, a kind of critical media literacy is very useful, I do push back on that narrative that everyone needs to learn to code to some degree. But that's a little bit of a separate conversation. Let's see, sorry. I think there was a comment in the chat from Guillermo. And I'm so glad to hear that you're Paraguayan American yourself. And yeah, Paraguay Educa, I mean, to their credit, they've done an amazing job. They've since pivoted actually to focusing on after school robotics clubs and specifically targeting girls, which I love. And I feel like, you know, based on some follow-up work I've done with them and also across the Bay Area, these robotics clubs are often the pathway that girls take into tech, into STEM careers. So I'm really heartened by the work that they've done with that. Let's see, I'm looking for other, oh, Julia, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thanks. So you had mentioned during your presentation that like some of the kids just, they simply weren't interested. And I think, you know, you mentioned soccer and maybe just cultural differences. And then speaking to, you know, to the point that you made about getting girls involved in tech, was there pushback from families in general, you know, against using the computers? And so, you know, teachers were kind of trying to like navigate getting familiar with it themselves and then also having the pushback from their local community. I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, it varied a lot. It's you know, the story that you maybe often hear from academics, it's complicated, but so some parents, you know, were busy enough with their own work and raising kids and all of that, that they just didn't engage with it a lot. There were some parents though, and a couple of them were actually also teachers. So they had gone through this teacher training. And one in particular who actually really got the vision of one laptop per child and was really excited about the vision. And so she tried to teach it to, she was a 5th grade teacher. She tried to teach it to her students, but she also tried to kind of guide her kids. And she would say just brilliant things like, you know, I don't want them using this like a TV. That's kind of what they do by default. You know, that's the most fun thing. And I'm trying to steer them towards something that will benefit them all their lives, right? That will help them develop their thinking. And I was like, yes, you're brilliant about this. And she was in many ways one of my main kind of informants, they often call them in ethnography, but you know, one of the key participants for me, because you know, she in some ways she sat in this middle ground right between Paraguay Educa and a lot of the other people involved in the project. And there were some others who were passionate about the project in various ways and understood maybe pieces of the vision. There were a few other parents, especially ones who had a little bit more familiarity with computers, who said similar things like, I don't want you using this like a TV. I don't want you just consuming media. I want you to do something more interesting with it, more creative. I'd hear those kinds of things. So there were certainly some parents who also contributed those kinds of narratives. I would say by and large, though, the fact that very few had really used computers before meant that a lot of them didn't have strong associations with it. They had heard about them. They had especially heard about the internet from television shows and such. So so they knew about that. But yeah, the other uses of the computer were not really well known by a lot of the people on the project.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Guillermo made a good point, just taking into account the context and the people from marginalized communities and, you know, just trying to empower others. So I thought that was a really good point that he made.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I jump in? Hi.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm a Paraguayan American, and I guess, you know, being raised in the U.S., I know the narrative that of the two communities that come from that. So Paraguayans is either you have money or you don't. There's no middle class. So it's a sad reality, but the people that are getting educated are not the ones that are being they're trying to empower the ones that are not, but it is just the context will play a huge role in that sense.
Yep.
Especially if they see that you come from a wealthy family, doesn't translate for them. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, it's about the stats I was looking at in 2010, at least kind of 10%, wealthy, fairly elite, often with really great connections to, government leaders and such. And 90% their subsistence farming is still very widespread. It's not 90%, something like 35%, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's very little safety net. And I saw that. I write in the book about a particularly heartbreaking moment in 2013 when some of the kids who had been involved with an after-school program Paraguay Educa had put on, programming the laptops, learning a little bit of Python, entered a programming competition. And they were the only school that entered outside of Asuncion. They were the only school that entered that wasn't a fairly elite private school. And they were the only school that entered that the kids hadn't been learning English all their lives, basically, or, since early elementary in any case. And watching these kids prepare, they were working so hard. And the language issue, just learning, all of these kind of random English words, and it was just simple things like instead of print, many of them would spell it peart because PR, somehow it was more logical to them, which in the context of not knowing much English, like, sure, you make those sorts of mistakes, even English programmers make those kind of mistakes often enough. But if you can imagine the additional layer that even just language put on that, and I highlight a lot of the other big structural issues that came up, that programming competition especially highlights, but that were really pervasive, right? The expectation that these children would somehow transcend decades of infrastructural, social, institutional inequality by using these laptops was just, it honestly was heartbreaking to see that. I call it cruel optimism. Cruel optimism, of course, is from affect theory, usually more applied to kind of the individual and the kind of affective attachment we might have to, for example, the beauty ideal. Which is a very kind of cruel kind of optimism that drives a lot of people towards particular behaviors. But I see it as possibly applying to these kinds of structural things too, right? The promises that these projects make and then the structural issues that they run up against is a kind of cruel optimism.
I wonder if I might use my chair prerogative to ask a question on something you didn't talk about here, but certainly is embedded within the book and the larger story. And that's how the kind of charismatic leaders of this movement, right, themselves were able to generate a lot of global interest and goodwill, getting the UN involved, getting corporations involved, getting big donors involved. Can you speak a little bit to that interesting twist? And is that something that's still going on? How does one counter it? How does one better educate that group of kind of donors and leaders who are really they're setting the policy at this level?
Yeah. I mean, if I were able to snap my fingers and totally transform that world, I would love for everybody to move away from these charismatic stories, these impossibly utopian stories, and say, I have a project for, an incremental, very community-based, long-term engagement with a particular group. I'm not going to be coming in as the expert who knows everything. I'm going to be coming in as someone learning from the community and supporting what they need as best I can, right? Give me money for that. And I would love for there to be a lot of funding around that. Given as much as I'd love to be able to snap my fingers and do that, given that the landscape is what it is, and these charismatic stories are often kind of required to get funding from these donors. What I generally say is, you can tell that story, but always have kind of a parallel track in your mind of like, this is what I'm actually doing. And this is how constantly I might have to translate between this story I tell and what's actually going on in the field. and not get caught up in the charisma myself, right? And I think that that's one thing that's really hard. I think I see across Silicon Valley more generally. People get really caught up in these stories. They aren't spending any time on the ground. And one thing that I find really frustrating, and this is partly from my own training as my undergrad degree in computer science, we were told over and over that we were the smartest people in the room, that we would figure out the right answers, right? And I think that is a lie, and I think it's pernicious, honestly. I think it is harmful because it sets up engineers, computer scientists, others who might hear that story as not needing to listen as carefully to the real needs of people on the ground. Sorry, that's a downer to end.
Morgan, so I think, I mean, well, that narrative also, it discredits like the humanities, you know, so it's not, it's like, it's an important focus of STEM, and especially like, you know, having women and young girls in STEM, but I think that what I like, the literature and just things that I've seen, like, why can't we raise them both up? Like, why can't we just raise it all up instead of only raising one? And I think that has a lot to do with like, with capitalism.
Yes.
I think so.
Part of the project I'm working on now, is part of its research, but part of it's actually curriculum development at Berkeley. And we are working on, we hope, possibly a new major that brings together the interpretive social sciences, humanities, and this very strong move Berkeley and many schools, I think, are facing towards data science, right? And bringing in kind of computer science and statistics, and at my own school, information science is kind of has been pulled into this, although we do have a lot more kind of interpretive and humanities focused people within our school. But when I look at the history of big intellectual movements in the past, and of course, many of them are intertwined with colonialism and positivism and all sorts of issues, right? But when I think about the ones that have changed the landscape of higher education, many of them have really tied in with the social sciences and humanities in a fundamental way. Like when we look at the history of cybernetics, as much as, you know, we're still living some of the legacies of that cybernetic movement of the 1950s and 60s, it certainly spawned many of the ideas of one laptop per child and that kind of society of mind of Marvin Minsky and such. But that brought together people from all across the academy, right? It was not just the kind of the STEM folks involved in that. It was very much behavioral psychologists and sociologists and all sorts of different people. So I feel like if we are going to, you know, if the current boom around AI isn't going to kind of fizzle out into another AI winter, we're really going to have to integrate and listen carefully to humanities, social sciences, and people from across the academy. I think that, I totally agree. The focus on STEM is in some cases harmful, and we really need more critical voices. This is certainly my own passion in teaching too. I teach all of those, like, wait a minute, let's step back and think about this a little more carefully and contextually. And my classes, much to my students' chagrin, tend to be very reading and writing heavy, but many of them coming in for technical degrees. But yes, I totally agree. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit now. I feel very strongly though too about this. All right, other questions, thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, I was just going to say, I see in chat, Abhi says, feel like some of this is the hubris of white privilege. And this is absolutely the case, right? There's this kind of savior complex. People have called it various things. White guilt in development is certainly a very big and often somewhat harmful factor. And it feeds into this, you know, some people know better than others what those others should do with their lives. But yeah, definitely a factor here.
I think I might recommend we close off here for the recording portion, but invite people to stay on more informally for a broader conversation. Thank you again, Morgan, for sharing your expertise and your time today. There's so much to talk about in your research and your teaching and where we go from here. So thank you again for bringing it all together today.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy. Sorry, this was such a pleasure. And thank you for these great questions so far. I'd love to keep chatting.
Okay.